Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host, Benjamin S. Woodford, here again for your Friday commute, 3 to 4 p.m. on 90.1 KZSU Stanford. We come back each and every week to bring you a new topic or a guest to talk about education in all its forms. We hope that if you are a parent, a student, a teacher, an educator, a researcher, a community member, or really, if you have a pulse, you'll tune in each week and listen to what we have to say. We're going to have an exciting interview today I've been really looking forward to. Today we have Dr. David Labaree here in the studio with us to have a great discussion on his, on many things, but also including his new book, A Perfect Mess: The Unlikely Ascendancy of American Higher Education. Dr. Labaree has a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree also in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania, and he got his BA at Harvard before all of that started. And I'm going to bring David on the mic now, and we're going to just kind of jump right in here. David, thank you for joining us today.
Ben, thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is all mine, or ours, right? Emily, say hello.
Hi.
We got Emily back in the house for another week, and those of you out in the studio audience, we hope you will stick with us for the hour. If you would like to text or call in, you could do it at 855-723-9010, or you could tweet at KZSU or at KZSUDJ. We are always happy to hear from our studio audience. And we're going to jump right in here, David. My first question, and something I think the audience would love to hear about, is you've got this long, prestigious record of where you've worked and the places you've been, and the books that you've written are really just amazing body of literature. And I'm curious, from the standpoint of kind of looking in from the outside and helping our studio audience understand who's on the other side of this mic, since they can't see you. How did you get to where you're at, and kind of, what are the ways we could look at this ascendancy into the place that you've reached, which is a great prestige?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think one of the things it's useful to do, especially when you're sitting in an institution like this one, Stanford, where we're all very proud of ourselves for being here.
Yeah, pats on the back all around, right?
And we see ourselves occupying the apex of the meritocracy. And so we can all tell stories about how we got here that have that classic achievement model behind it. How we earned our way up.
Nobody helped us. We jumped right in, and we were so great that we just got what we deserved, right?
Yeah, and
it's a popular narrative.
Yeah, and it's very reassuring to us, and it makes us feel better about ourselves, and it helps us explain why we're in this cushy situation here when other people are not, because we deserved it. That's why. It's nice to be deserving.
It feels nice to be able to say I got here by my own merit, right? That's a nice way to think about ourselves specifically, right?
Yeah. So, I could tell my story about getting here two different ways. So let me tell you the sort of standard, comforting, self-aggrandizing story.
Okay, I like it. Let's hear it.
Which is, you can sort of spin this as a climbing up through the system story. One of the peculiarities of American higher ed is that it's very, very stratified. There's a huge gap between the top and the bottom, between these highly selective research universities that admit 5% of the people who apply, and the technical schools and the community colleges at the bottom that accept everybody, and all the stages in between. And so that's not something that people elsewhere in the world experience very much. So that kind of stratification isn't nearly as obvious. There's less sense about the being at the top or the bottom. So when I graduated from college, I ended up getting a degree, a PhD at University of Pennsylvania, which was a good place to be. Ivy League. It's the wrong end of the Ivy League, but it's still the Ivy League. It's not Princeton or Yale, but it's close enough. And But the years after that, entering into the professoriate were kind of not that exciting. The first year I got offered a job at a place that was so bad, I'll leave it unnamed, that I chose to remain unemployed rather than to accept the offer.
Okay, yeah.
I can recall it was a place where the model was if you taught a course, you were allowed to require one book, a textbook.
Okay, yeah.
And you had to guarantee to use it for at least 5 years because they were going to buy it and then read it to the students. Nothing else could you do. And so I'm thinking,
that seems very restrictive, right?
Wow, I guess it's going to be a chapter a week. That's my job.
Was it your book?
No, it was a textbook. So I said, So I started out the first year, I was just a lecturer at Penn, and I was teaching at community colleges. I taught at community colleges the whole time I was in graduate school, 7 years, and I taught at a regional state university at the same time. So I had a lot of experience at the bottom end of the system, and I was trying to move up, but it wasn't working very well. So the first year I sort of slapped together stuff. The second year I finally got offered a job, but it was a 1-year appointment at Georgetown.
So maybe a stepping stone, but not exactly a secure position.
Yeah, and it didn't work out well. Sociology at Georgetown was akin to socialism.
Oh, great.
Which
has a bad rap in America.
Yeah, well, the Jesuits in particular didn't like that very much. So they put us in the basement of the dormitory. And my office had a window up at grass level. I could see people's feet going by.
Maybe a lot of dogs getting walks.
Yeah, and every time they flushed the toilet upstairs in the dormitory, it went right through this big pipe over my head. So,
these are your glory days.
Yeah, I remember that as being great. And, I applied everywhere in the world that year. I got interviewed at 4 places, including Georgetown. And the only job I got was a place I didn't want to be. All the others were very cool.
Okay.
In various degrees. So I ended up at a place called Widener University. What is Widener University? Well, it used to be in the 1960s the Pennsylvania Military College.
Okay. Okay. That would be considered like a trade school kind of?
Yeah. And, they still had some faculty from that period because all they needed was a master's degree to become a faculty member.
Okay.
So a wealthy family in Philadelphia bought them, gave them the Widener name. They went out and bought a law school, called themselves a university. But it was an open access, private institution mostly made up of students who had gone through the Catholic school system and would do anything to avoid going to a public institution.
Okay, yeah.
But it was not a great experience in lots of ways. I was allowed to use a textbook and a reader. Whoa.
You're getting a lot of freedom as you progress through your...
We're climbing up. We're getting there.
Yeah, and all you need to do is, teach a course, a chapter a week, and then offer 4 multiple choice exams based on the publisher's, examination list. So,
well, it makes your job easier anyway. It doesn't require a lot of creativity.
So I was like, okay, I thought I'd kind of bottomed out of the system at that time. This is a place that was hardly a college at all. And so I was desperate, and I found the savior was I got a job at Michigan State University in the School of Education, not sociology. Education, it turns out, is a much happier place to be.
Yeah.
For one thing, they have students. It's nice to have students.
Yeah, you need a clientele, right?
When you have students, you have jobs. It's like no students, no jobs. So that was great. Michigan State is like a second-tier state university. It's not the University of Michigan. Every time I told people, hey, I'm going to Michigan State, they'd say, wow, I love Ann Arbor. And I'd say, I love Ann Arbor, too. I'm going to be in East Lansing. So,
but they just tag you with what they know, right?
But it was a great place. It's a land-grant university. It used to be an ag school, turned into a research university. So they loved the fact that they were land-grant and AAU at the same time, and so it was a wonderful place. I taught there for 18 years.
Oh, wow.
there was no reason to not to stay, except that a job popped up here at Stanford. And
that's a reason to leave.
You were willing to leave all that to come here?
I was willing to leave central Michigan. We're the only ski mountain in central Michigan, and lower Michigan in general is a landfill.
Classy, yeah.
It had a rope tow to take you up to the top of
I'm
the
sure
landfill.
the snow keeps the smell down, right?
Yeah. But anyway, I love being there. But this is the West Coast. The weather's better.
Sure, yeah. California has a few perks over Michigan.
It's got a fancy brand name. So I came here, and then it's like I suddenly found that as soon as I got to Stanford, I got smarter.
Yeah, this is the letterhead effect, right? You mentioned this in your book, and I love that concept because I've noticed the same exact thing. I showed up here, and all of a sudden I'm smarter. Yeah. The whole world thinks I'm smarter now, and I'm like, have I changed that much? I hope maybe, but
look at you. You've got your own radio show.
I know. It must be the letterhead effect.
Have
right?
something to
it's
say.
like a sponge. You just soak what's around you.
So I just found suddenly I was getting invitations I never got.
Mm-hmm.
An old friend who's Swedish suddenly announced the moment I told him this was going to happen. He said, well, we'd like to invite you as a visiting professor to our institution. I said, wow, that's nice. He said, well, honestly, I can get I can get funding for this now because they've heard of Stanford and never heard of Michigan State.
Right.
So I was like, okay, so I'm willing to take that. But anyway,
Sure.
It looks like a rags to riches story, climbing up through the ladder, starting out in the depths and moving your way up to the very top of the system.
Working in the community colleges and then ending up in the top of the top, right?
I know.
So working between the different levels of education, higher education, what would you say some of the biggest differences or things that really stick them out as being maybe more functional, less functional of an institution?
I don't know. I mean, what's interesting is that as I look back on it, most of the teaching I did was at the community colleges, and I just loved that. That was great. You had a mixed age group. You were teaching people. A lot of people were working, teaching a course on marriage and the family to a bunch of people who were married, and I wasn't, and had families, and I didn't.
Ironic, right?
It was kind of cool, teaching criminology to a class filled with cops. That was kind of interesting.
Right.
No, I loved that. And so the student part of it was great all the way through. But the experience for faculty is wildly different.
Yeah.
The hierarchy is such that every step you move up in the hierarchy, you have better pay, you have lower teaching loads, you have more support, you have better physical plant. You have support for research. You're teaching more graduate students. The academic training of the students keeps getting better. Life is really good at the top of this system.
Sure.
And it's a lot harder at the bottom.
Right.
Teaching.
Got to pay your dues, right? 2
classes a semester versus 5. And all the range in between. So it's like, wow. Anyway, so that's kind of this is the feel-good story about how
So let's flip the coin over here, right? What's the behind-the-scenes story, the not rags to riches hero story, but maybe the other side?
Yeah, so the other side is that both of my parents grew up on a university campus. Both of their fathers were university professors. I'm in the family business.
Right.
Really.
It was almost expected that this is where you would end up, right?
It was kind of an interesting university. It wasn't the usual one. It was Lincoln University, which is a historically black university in southeast Pennsylvania, whose faculty was entirely made up of white clergymen.
Wow, what a contrast. Yeah.
It was kind of it was sort of a missionary job in a lot of ways. And so both of my grandfathers were Presbyterian ministers and professors. But it means that, the cultural capital was there. The sort of the pathway was there. This seemed like a natural thing to be doing.
Right.
And it looks back on it, it was kind of like I was killing time for a while before I moved into the family business and became a professor.
Well, you had to create your rags to riches story, so you couldn't just end up at the top right away.
And you look at it too and say, well, okay, but great. I went to a fancy undergraduate school. I went to a fancy graduate school, but just go back and look at the undergraduate. I coasted my way through undergraduate. Harvard is a place, it's sort of like the social register. It's hard to get into, but it's impossible to flunk out of. And so I stopped going to classes for the most part. I used one notebook for all of my classes in the last 3 years of my 4-year degree.
But did you use the social opportunities?
Not much. This was the 60s. I was in the Students for Democratic Society. I sort of majored in radical politics and kind of coasted along. And I ended up with a perfect 2.5 average at the end.
All right.
Oh, yeah. B minus, C plus. Go for it. High achiever, meritocracy at its best.
Right. You mastered it.
And so I ended up getting into Penn.
Right.
It's like, why?
Well, there's got to be something there.
So it's like people struggle to get into these elite places, but, I came in with this very mediocre record and high standardized test scores, which is a really bad combination because it means you've got the ability, but you just didn't do the work.
Right, right.
Really, is this the student you want to bring in?
That's a lot worse than not having the ability but working your butt off, right?
It's like this is somebody who was coasting along and, it's like, really, we don't want this. So one of the early stories I learned about that is that when you go to a place like Harvard, you get a pass, however well you did.
Right.
Nobody looks at your 2.5 average. They say, oh, he went to Harvard. He must be good. He didn't do much, but
right.
He looks like our kind of people. And,
sure.
So that was, again, one of those things that just popped up. And then the rest of it is just, putting in time until my natural worth came out.
It was there all along, obviously. Yeah.
So it's like, it's when I look back and I say, well, where else would I have ended up? I mean, really, it seems like that. And so you can play that both ways. And it feels better one way, but really, really, there was a whole bunch of things that said, this is where you're going to go.
Right. And I find this two sides to the story thing really compelling because I think people are a lot of times afraid to talk about their privilege, or they don't want to admit that they even have privilege. And it's always all about the meritocracy. I did this because I was worthy. And while that's true for all of us at some level, you don't get anywhere without putting in work. At the same time, there's another side to the story for every single person, the people who helped us, the opportunities we didn't earn, but we got anyway, the chance happenings and lucky opportunities and moments of kind of turning that push us in a new direction. Let
me give you another example of that.
Yeah.
So there I was, when I graduated, I tried the real world for a little while.
That's scary. I'll stay away. Yeah.
I went to work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Banker. Suits. Yeah. Wow. 4 years. And I was panicking that I was going to become a lifer. A group of us would sit there at lunch and say, 4 years here, you're a lifer. You're going to have that sallow look. Mm-hmm. You're going to start counting the years until retirement.
Sleeping in a suit.
Vested in your pension, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I think, got to get out. So I grew a beard, which if you're a banker is a good way of saying, I don't want to be a banker.
You don't look like everybody else at that point, so you don't fit in, right?
Yeah. And so I went and hired a psychologist to tell me what kind of career I should get into. And he gave me a whole bunch of tests. And then he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a writer. He said, you should be a writer. Just write me a check. So
it's a very insightful experience you had there.
So, I worked at a newspaper for a little while, and then I didn't like that. I finally applied for a job in the want ads in the same newspaper, and one of them said the local community college was hiring somebody to teach either English or sociology. So I talked to the head of the social science department. And what did I have? A bachelor's degree.
Right.
I shouldn't be teaching college with a bachelor's degree. The normal thing in community college is you have a master's, and a lot of community college teachers have PhDs. So, but guess what? The chair of the department went to Harvard.
Ah, so you got another pass.
You know, he said, the degree, let's not worry about the degree.
Yeah, yeah.
So, isn't that nice? It's
so
nice how
it actually
work
is
out.
nice, because if he didn't give you that pass, we may not be having this conversation.
I know. So see, privilege should be rewarded because good things happen as a result of it. Is that your story, Ben? Is that the story of this whole broadcast? Moderate education.
I think we will come back around to the moral of the story towards the end of the hour. We haven't figured out where we're going yet. But I think I can take us in a new direction here. So one thing that I really stood out for me is this idea that you brought up in your book. Remember, the book, David's new book, is A Perfect Mess, The Unlikely Ascendancy of American Higher Education, which I read last night and I couldn't put it down, honestly. But one of the topics you bring up is that name brands matter. And I think from the standpoint of a lot of people who live in a first-generation college student situation, or they don't have the pedigree of knowing really the value of education, college is college is college. And I think you said something to that effect in your book as well. And I would like to help just kind of break down the difference between what different name brands afford you as far as moving up the social ladder. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, this very hierarchical system that we have. On the one hand, it's extremely stratified with radical differences between top and bottom. But on the other hand, there's a kind of fake equivalence that's there, and it's even there in the language. For example, when I'm talking with Europeans, and actually anybody other than Americans about U.S. higher ed, I have to be careful because college and university mean different things in the rest of the world.
Sure.
College means what we would call like a technical school and maybe a community college. But if you're going to get a bachelor's degree or higher, it's university. And so university is, you say, I'm going to university.
Right. And so that has a different meaning.
And
more
going
prestige.
to college is a very different thing.
Sure.
But in the U.S., it's really interesting because we use the two interchangeably, and in many ways we prefer college. If you say, I'm going to university, it sounds really pretentious.
Right.
Ooh, aren't you special? You're going to university. Oh, isn't that nice? And so
the posh view of what you're doing
I know,
in school,
but that's
right?
if you're a Canadian, that's what you would say. I'm going to university.
Right.
And so that in itself is really interesting because there's a kind of faux equality there.
And language matters here,
Yeah.
right? The way you describe it changes the perception.
So if I'm going to community college, I'm going to college. If I'm going to Harvard, I'm going to college.
Right.
It sounds like, and in this country, almost anybody can go to college. And the majority of people leaving high school do go to college, but they go to very different kinds of colleges.
Right.
And part of what that system does is that by having, on the one hand, it's a highly accessible system. And so you can, if you're a first generation, if you as parents have never had a kid in college and you can tell people, my son's going to college and they're going to the community college. They are. It's a big deal.
Sure.
It's a big deal. And it's an important thing, but what they're not aware of is the fact that the payoff is very different.
So just like different degrees have different sort of value in the marketplace, different places that you've gotten those degrees also have a different value.
Yeah, it's what Emily was saying earlier, this sort of what the credential effect or the brand name effect we were talking about earlier. It really has a thing. There's a sort of signal it's sending. You say, oh, you went to an Ivy League school. Oh, you went to a state university. Oh, you went to the regional state university. Okay, it wasn't U of C, it was CSU.
Right.
And so that's, you went to community college. These are sending out lots of different meanings in the in the occupational force, and particularly for people who went to the elite schools, it means a lot which school you went to.
Right. And as you said before, kind of the GPA may not even matter as much, even if that's a good indicator of your long-term work ethic. The difference between a GPA, 3.0 at Harvard versus a 3.0 at community college has a vastly different value in the marketplace.
Yeah, you get a pass. And so that really makes a big difference, so that the basic rule for the upper middle class families that are so insanely focused on what kind of school their kids are going to go to, the key thing is you want to get into the most selective institution you can, the one at the highest rank in the U.S. News and World Report listings.
Right.
And so that's why you have this sort of this model. If you have the stretch school that you would really like to get into, but you might
maybe you don't have the grades for it or something.
One that's sort of like pretty much that's doable, and then the safety school, if nothing else comes through,
right,
I can always get in there.
Sure.
And so, and you're really disappointed if you don't get the one at the top, but getting the one at the bottom is like total failure.
And this is the dynamic you see in many of the middle and upper middle class families, where it's like, my kid's going to go to Stanford, or my kid's going to go to law school, or be a doctor, right? And this is because they understand that to reproduce their success in the world requires an education that will allow that, because they can't just hand down their position to their kids like they used to do with royalty and things of that nature.
Yeah, and it's a big deal, particularly in a cosseted community like the one we live in, Palo Alto, where in the heart of Silicon Valley, where everybody's hyper-educated and overpaid, and meritocrat. You have this thing that for a high school kid or any kind of student in Palo Alto, you can't just say, I'm going to college. Well, duh, of course you're going to college.
Right, that's a foregone conclusion.
One that matters, and there are only a few that really count.
Sure.
There may be 20 in the country that are good enough for you, but and so it's really interesting to watch that happen. It starts really early. I had a doctoral student here. He's Israeli, and he brought his family with him, and his kids were in school, and his son was in third grade, and he came home after a couple of months being in the U.S. and in his new class. He came home and he said, Dad, he said, third grade, remember, am I Stanford material?
Wow, that's 8 years old for those of us who don't have kids. 8-year-old talking about, am I Stanford material? It's like sad, right?
It's really sick.
Yeah.
And he was like, he had a great attitude. He said, no, you're not. He said, and neither am I. Put it out of your mind.
Right.
So, but there's that kind of distinction.
Well,
is really powerful.
that parent had a good idea in thinking about it, like, hey, that doesn't matter right now. But a lot of parents are putting their kids in tutoring at that age, and they're doing there's nothing wrong with tutoring. I love tutoring. I tutored for years. But the point is, a kid needs a chance to grow up before we can even say if they're Stanford material or not. Yeah. And then on top of that, nobody's really Stanford material, because it's all lottery. Once you get up into the top 4% of students and grades and all these other things, there still isn't enough room for everybody.
Yeah. And so you end up having this situation where it's a system that's very hierarchical, but it's not obviously so.
You referred to this in your book as the insider knowledge, right?
Yeah, and so you really need to have the cultural and social capital to say, it's which college you go to that matters. That's especially true now when it's a majority phenomenon. The majority of high school graduates go to some kind of post-secondary schooling. So at that point, it's not very special to go to college. It's very special to go to this college versus that.
Right. And this is kind of the effect of degree inflation, right? If everybody's getting a degree, now a degree is worth a lot less than it used to be.
So two things happen when everybody reaches the same, when going to college now becomes the new form of universal schooling. One is that it's no longer as special as it used to be.
Right.
So what happened after Second World War, after the huge expansion in high school enrollments took place?
Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
Just to set the stage for everybody listening. You talked about this in your book, how the war essentially created a big boom to need colleges because they were set up with the infrastructure to kind of support the war effort and the research and the different things that were needed. Is that a reasonable summary of the boom there?
Yeah, wars are very good for universities,
okay.
Unless you happen to be in the war zone. And so for the U.S.,
that's not good for anybody.
The U.S., the two world wars were a great experience for us because they were fought on other people's land.
Right.
And the universities benefited from them a lot, especially the Second World War. Stanford wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be in this place if it hadn't been for the Second World War, which gave them a boost in electrical engineering field and give them the opening to move up from being a mediocre private university on the West Coast to being a contender.
Yeah. And that was a byproduct, essentially, of the need of the country, right?
Yeah, and so they were serving a useful need during the war, and then afterwards they were able to cash in, and the federal government needed a reward for the GIs who had been risking their lives, and figured like giving the GI Bill was a way to sort of pay that debt off a bit. Okay, we'll give you a free ride in your educational quest. The other reason they passed that law, by the way, was that there was a total panic about what happens when 7 million people enter the workforce at one time.
Because they're all coming back.
They're all coming back.
Oh, man, yeah.
And remember, the Depression was the Depression was getting worse just before the war started.
Right.
And so the war really saved the U.S. from the end of the Great Depression. It wasn't the New Deal. It was the war. And first of all, a huge amount of government spending. And secondly, you take a whole bunch of people out of the workforce. And it had a nice effect. So one of the things about the GI Bill was that it kept people out of the workforce for a while.
So it was serving as a buffer, essentially.
Yeah, it was a kind of like, let's ease back into the workforce instead of having everybody come in on day one.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we were talking about this in terms of the expansion of college and the university system in America, right? Mm-hmm. And now this big proliferation happened essentially because of the war, and now we're talking about the big push to get kind of everybody to go to college, I guess, which happened around that same time and shortly after. What made college such a popular choice, or how did we start selling this idea that everyone goes to college?
Well, I mean, the thing that education has done for people since maybe the beginning of the 20th century is it's been the mechanism for allocating people to social positions. It's the way to get a good job. In particular, with the rise of the white-collar workforce, professional work, managerial work, high-level clerical work, the education suddenly started to have a kind of utility about it that wasn't really obvious until the end of the 19th century. The fact that you could by going to college, you could get yourself into the kind of white-collar jobs that were now the heart of the new middle class. And so if you're a middle-class family and you want to pass on your position to your kids, the problem they were facing at the end of the 19th century is you couldn't pass on the family business anymore. Middle class used to mean you owned your own business. You owned your own shop. You were a master shoemaker and sold your wares, and you'd pass the business on to your kids. That's how you did it.
And so this sort of broke down when corporations were able to reduce the amount of cost and time and improve the precision of manufacturing.
Yeah, so small business disappears. Small shops are pushed out by the department stores. The apprenticeship system disappeared, so the way of working your way up to being a master artisan was no longer there. So what do? I mean, you're in a really interesting position, and it's still there, and it helps explain why middle-class families are still so obsessed about schooling, is you can pass your wealth onto your kids.
Mm-hmm.
You can't give an occupational position to them.
Right. And
if both parents are doctors, you can pass on the money you've accumulated, but you can't make your kids doctors. They have to go through the whole educational process in order to get there.
Right. And so that gives them the merit once they've gone through that system. Now they've earned the merit, presumably.
Yeah. So what it means is that you have to invest in your kids' education. That becomes your obsession.
Right.
And you have to figure out how every possible way you can provide an advantage to your kids in getting that educational edge that's going to allow them to get a better job than these other kids that don't have that edge. And so we see parents doing that kind of thing in a really big way. On a small scale, it's like the idea that starting in maybe ninth grade, you start thinking, okay, you need to take the right courses in order to look good when on the college application form. You want to make sure you were a math teacher, Ben. You want to make sure that by senior year you're in something cool like, say, calculus, and you're not still in algebra 2, right?
Right. Well, that's kind of a death sentence to your college career if you haven't gotten through calculus in high school.
I know. It's like, this is what you have to do. So
that was me.
That was you.
We were discussing how earlier with math, that just like how it's so difficult to like comprehend in the way that it's taught. And then that sometimes disadvantages like this whole system where it's like how math is taught in high school and how it's regulated in a certain way of like, this is how you teach, you follow this textbook. And Ben was mentioning at one point as well, like how a page should be, was it like an hour long? You should be looking at a page.
That's more like higher mathematics.
Yeah.
But the point, I think the point is that math serves as a gatekeeper for a lot of people's opportunity in school, which is, I think, maybe purposely done. Do you think that's part of this meritocracy thing that you're describing, that math plays a part in that?
I mean, you're basically, in the meritocracy, you're trying to accumulate as many merit badges as you possibly can. And you can't have too many. That's one of the interesting things.
Right.
The obsession is such that you always have to try to, let's get a little more.
This sounds like a big piece of this overachiever work all the time kind of ethic that's worked its way into our society. Everybody thinks they always need to do more, and it's almost based on this idea of the unlimited merit badges, right? There's never enough. There's no point of saturation.
So you look at in high school. So of course you have to get your math courses lined up so you end up with calculus. But you also need to get as many advanced placement courses as you possibly can, because that looks cool on your record. And by the way, in a lot of high schools now, you get extra points for that if you take exam.
This is where your GPA goes above 4.0, right?
Right. So 4.0 is perfect, but if you're taking a bunch of advanced placement classes, you can get a 5.0. You can be above perfect. Right. I mean, that's a merit badge.
I feel like that really devalues the whole 4.0 grade point average as being a perfect anything, right?
It does. But so you got to do that. And then you've got to start doing test preparation. You got to take the preliminary SATs. You've got to start doing the college tour. That's a very big institution in middle class families, and particularly in upper middle class. You start visiting college campuses. You start checking things out, the possibilities. You look around for an advisor that can help find the right niche for you. And then you're building up a resume that's designed to attract the eye of an admissions officer at a selective institution.
Right.
So it's not just the right classes. You also have to be in the right school. So middle-class families are very good at buying a house in the right school district.
Okay, I want to take this and run with it, because I'm already conscious, like, we are running out of time. I have so many more things I want to talk to you about.
Yeah.
So you brought up in your book about how the college land grabs and the sort of push out west became essentially a way to build colleges to increase the value of land, and it even is still here in the district zoning as a way essentially to protect the land value and to, appreciate the value of houses in certain areas.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting thing. I was kind of surprised about this when I started working on the book, was that you look at why people were founding colleges in the U.S., it had very little to do with higher education. It had very little to do with advanced learning. They were building colleges in the wrong place. They were building colleges where there were no people. It's still
no
true.
clientele, right?
It's still true if you look at it. The high colleges and even major state universities are not located in big cities. They're located in the sticks.
Right.
Europeans find that very puzzling. Why would you do that? And as a business plan, it's kind of stupid. Like, your customers are in the city. Let's build it in the country where there are no customers. So it's pretty obvious from this that the idea here is not responding to customer demand. There's something else going on. There's a supply side story here. Mm-hmm. And the supply side story in the U.S. is that this was a country that had too much land and not enough buyers.
So it was a way to legitimize your land choice. Huge
amount of land out there. And land speculation was the national business. Mm-hmm. And but the problem is there's so much land out there. Why would they buy yours and not somebody else's? And remember, the federal government was giving land away. Mm-hmm. That kind of undercuts your market, doesn't it? So how do I say this is a special piece of land here?
Right.
And one way of doing that was to say, this is not a dusty agricultural town as it looks to a the untutored. This is a cultural center.
Right.
And what says culture better than a college, right?
Yeah.
So what you found, and this was a very standard pattern, that land speculators would say, okay, they're going to take a plot of land in the very middle of their holdings, donate it to a college, set up a college, try to find a religious affiliation for it, which gives you a little bit of income, and it supplies you with a cheap group of teachers, namely the
clergy.
The clergy, just like my grandfathers were in that same tradition.
Right.
Clergy operating at low pay as college professors. And so that makes the land around it more valuable. So it's basically the college town was what the modern equivalent would be the golf course community.
Right. And this is still happening.
You build a golf course and then you sell the houses all around it at a premium.
Right.
So, and
golf course fronted property is better, right?
Is that why Donald Trump is building golf courses?
Of course. You don't make money with golf courses. You make money selling the land around golf courses.
Oh, wow,
That's the basic rule of thumb. And so it was so this is why, for example, by the 1880s, Ohio had 35 colleges and France had 10.
Yeah, because Ohio was a more profound cultural hub than France ever was, right?
Exactly. And Ohio at that point was the frontier, and so that's where you wanted to be, and that's where the land was, so that's where you built the colleges.
Wow. Okay, so I wish we need to do like 3 more hours on this, David, but I'm just going to jump right to kind of the end of the book now, okay? Now, I hope it's not spoiling it for anyone who still wants to read the book. You should definitely go out and get it if you are interested and it's something that is calling to you. The book is A Perfect Mess, The Unlikely Ascendancy of American Higher Education, and the author is David Labaree here in the studio with us. Now, near the end of the book, you really make it clear what this perfect mess is, right? And there's way too many details for us to talk about today, but you make the point that American schools came about through sort of a mess of competing interests. And because of that, they've essentially grown up to be able to serve a lot of different needs. And you are arguing, and I think rightly so in my own opinion, not that that's worth all that much, but I'll give it anyway, in that because we serve so many different needs, essentially the American school system, it could not be reproduced ever again. And what it's doing right now is sort of perfect in its own confusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting problem because you look at, I talk a lot to European colleagues about this, and they're always surprised about how this system came about, because it doesn't look at all the way European universities came about. And Europe invented the university back in the Middle Ages. So, but the thing about it is that the American system is a system, but it's a system without a plan. Nobody planned it.
Right.
And nobody's really in charge of it.
It's very decentralized, right?
Very
Even within
decentralized.
a single university has multiple colleges that are doing their own thing.
Yeah, it's very decentralized. There has never been a national university in the U.S., whereas in other countries, the national universities are the cool ones that have been there forever. The service academies are the closest equivalent we have to a federal institution. It's a state and local phenomenon. And part of what's interesting is that it turns out that this very messy start to the system, where people were starting colleges to make money selling land rather than to advance learning. What made them kind of ridiculous in the 19th century made them strong in the 20th century. And that was, it was not a planned system, it was an emergent system. It was an organically evolving system. And like any other evolutionary process, there's no teleology here. It's not that there was a purpose it's designed to do. What people were setting up colleges for are not the function they ended up serving later on.
Right.
They set them up to make money selling land, and they ended up turned into a system that is the envy of the world right now.
Right.
I mean, 50 of the top universities in the world are in the U.S., 8 of the top 10. And so something about this process of having a system that emerges from the bottom up rather than the top down, that is not controlled by the education ministry and dictated from above, where there's a lot of adaptability, a lot of local autonomy, and even, as you pointed out, within the university structure itself, a radically decentralized system. We have departments that kind of operate on their own. We have centers and institutes that are just kind of sitting there in an organizational chart that would drive a business planner crazy, because it's like a jumble, like who's in charge?
Right.
Who's setting the tone?
So are you suggesting that by having a decentralized, like kind of unregulated, where you can easily make these changes, is beneficial for universities?
Yeah, and I think it's beneficial for society as well. Because the interesting thing is that these universities, by being, they operate from the bottom up. It's a very entrepreneurial system. Every professor at an American college is in some ways an entrepreneur, a hustler out there, carving out a career, selling their brand, and trying to find a zone of research that they can have an impact in. Turns out that when you leave things open like that, cool stuff happens. Lots of crappy stuff happens. Lots of stuff that's like the ridiculous kinds of research happens. But the problem is, you can't sit in the ministry in Paris or Washington and say, here are the 5 things we need to spend in the next 10 years we need to focus on in terms of developing research and programs. That's guessing that future is not a way that works. I mean, a planned educational system works no better than a planned economy does in a lot of ways.
Right. And I love that you brought us here, because this idea of there's some frivolous things happening in the system, and that needs to happen for the real things to happen. I mean, if you look in using your analogy of entrepreneurship, 9 out of 10 startups fail. But the point is, to get that one that's a Google or the Amazon or whatever it happens to be, you need 9 other ideas to not work out. And that's essentially what's happening in this idea entrepreneurship, is we need to allow for a lot of ideas to be sort of washed through the system before we find those real gems that truly change and shape society. And so it sounds like you're talking about just we need to not only tolerate this, but we need to embrace it as being the reality of how we push things forward.
Yeah, the organizational theorist Jim March used to describe universities as organized anarchies, which I kind of like. The title, A Perfect Mess, is like just another take on that same idea.
Yeah.
And it's the apparently anarchic quality about it is actually what makes it work well.
Yeah. Now, this is the point I was hoping we'd have time to get to, because you point out in the end of the book that people are starting to set their sights on creating accountability and standards and reducing spending and increasing efficiency in colleges. And you make the claim, which I think you would stand behind today if I had time to let you talk about it more, that needs to not happen, that the colleges need to keep this autonomy, and that standards and a deep accountability like we were doing essentially in high schools and maybe even community colleges, definitely elementary schools, could essentially tear down this perfect mess that we have organically grown into this, this worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, I think colleges need to be allowed to sort of work their magic. That's a hard case to make because they're expensive. They're public goods that people are supporting with tax dollars and that individuals are supporting with their tuition and with their opportunity cost. It's an expensive thing, but it turns out it works best when it's left to its own devices and we don't try to force it into a rationalized structure. We don't try to make it look like General Motors.
Right.
And so, often business leaders would say, why don't you set up the university like a corporation? Let's have a CEO that's really in charge and the orders come down the line. And the fact is that really doesn't work well. And one of the interesting things is that even industry has noticed that. If you look at the Silicon Valley model of organization, it's highly decentralized. There's a lot of autonomy. You go and run with this project and see what you can come up with. We can't dictate where this is going to go. We'll see, and some of these things are going to turn out to be great and others are not, and we're going to be better that way. So in some ways, business is now organizing itself like a university.
Well, corporations do things like this where they'll have a skunk works department that works on a completely autonomous, independent section of the business that nobody's overseeing except for internally.
Right.
And that's ways that they've found that they can create big change and innovation.
Something cool happens that way. Yeah.
Right. Now, this is something that I think came to me as I was reading this, in that we are essentially treating lower education and higher education very differently. And I think personally, and I'd love your take on this, that allowing standards and sort of top-down management of our lower education system so essentially forces higher education into those crosshairs, because now we're saying this is the way education should look, and it's okay to mandate that at a very high level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real interesting parallel with lower and higher education. I mean, the standards and school reform movement, the accountability movement, has been really zeroing in on K-12 education in the last 20 years or so. And they've been imposing lots of rationalization, accountability, targets, metrics, and so on, in a system that, when you look at the history of K-12, this is a story for another day, but it's also a very emergent system. There was nobody in charge. There is no national system of education. There's not even a state system of education.
Right.
You have 15,000 individual school districts that run education, radically decentralized. And it's not until the 1980s or 90s that we ever said, oh, we need to have accountability here.
Right.
And so somehow America ended up becoming this dominant power in the world with an education system that was highly decentralized and quite accountable. And now we're trying to change that. Maybe that's a bad move, Right. Maybe we're squeezing the magic out of the system by trying to stamp it into some standardized mode, which it was never in before. Yeah,
and that, I think, might have to be where we leave it for today. This hour went by so quick, David. I wish we could have 10 more for just about this one book, honestly.
This has been fun talking with the two of you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate you coming in. This is Dr. David Labaree visited us today. He's from the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and his book is A Perfect Mess, The Unlikely Ascendancy of American Higher Education. David, thank you again so much for coming in today. This was a great conversation, and I personally think if people are interested, they should think about reading some of your books, because they are truly, I think, information everybody should be armed with if they have a kid or they want to be successful in this country.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.